Hello, my name is Ian Kerman and I'm a master's student at the Georgia Institute of Technology in Computer Science. Today I will be presenting my work in progress titled The Effectiveness of Multiple Choice Type Flashcards for the Identification of Fish Species. Underwater surveys are used to measure populations of fish, other animals, and even algae. In order to do this, the scuba diver must be able to quickly and correctly identify the species by sight. This requires a significant time commitment to learn all of the species in a given underwater environment. The Reef Environmental Education Foundation, or Reef, maintains a worldwide fish, invertebrate, and algae survey project. There have been over 200,000 surveys submitted to the database, whose contents are used by scientists and governments around the world. In order to ensure high-quality data, Reef requires advanced divers to take identification exams to prove their ability to correctly identify species. Flashcards are a common way for divers to study for these exams. And if you're like me, you've used flashcards throughout your studies to help prepare for exams of all kinds. Online and mobile learning offer options beyond the traditional paper flashcards. Some applications, such as Quizlet, are a paper-on-glass substitute for flashcards, allowing users to create their own decks and share them with others. Other applications like Duolingo utilize a wide variety of studying interfaces, from matching pairs of words like shown here to implementing speech recognition to test a user's speaking skills. One interface that Duolingo uses is what I've called a multiple choice flashcard, or multicard. A multicard asks the user a question and then offers 4 choices for the user to choose from. This is in some ways similar to a flashcard if you imagine one side of the flashcard asking what is the answer on the other side. But instead of forcing pure recall, it gives the user options, making the user not only choose which answer is right, but at the same time also which answers are not right. I decided to test the effectiveness of this type of interface as a studying tool compared to flashcards and using fish identification as a topic being studied. Applications like Quizlet and Duolingo allow worldwide access to learning tools created once, enabling large-scale distribution. In order to meet Reef's goals of collecting fish surveys around the world, it is exactly tools like these that it requires. There's been a lot of research done on flashcards and their effectiveness, particularly on what to study using flashcards and how to use them. It has been found that making one's own flashcards doesn't really help as much as one might intuitively think. Instead, it's been found that pre-made flashcards work just as well. Lin et al. Found that more complex or conceptual flashcards work better in improving student performance over basic word definition. Kagan, in a similar way, found that including pictures on flashcards improved vocabulary recall over flashcards that only had words on them. The concept of spacing, or how long one waits between studying the same flashcard again, has been studied extensively, finding that spacing over an entire deck is better than splitting the deck up and studying each subset separately. Spacing is also effective over long and short-term periods of time. Taking previous research into account, I designed an experiment to test the effectiveness of a multicard studying tool compared to a flashcard study tool. I recruited volunteers from both Georgia Tech and Facebook, targeting specifically scuba diving groups. Volunteers were randomly assigned to one of the tools and then were asked to study for at least 5 minutes a day for 3 days. Cartoon fish with made-up names were used to remove any bias that might have occurred from a volunteer already knowing that species of fish. Then after 3 days, the volunteers were locked out of the studying tool and had to wait 24 hours before they could take their test. Both a flashcard tool and a multicard tool were built as a mobile-friendly web application. Shown here is a flashcard tool with both the picture and name side visible. Volunteers could use the tool for as long as they wanted and could go back and forth through the deck. This is a multicard tool showing the mode where the volunteer is asked to name the fish shown and then identify the fish by name. When volunteers selected one of the options, it would highlight green if the answer was correct, otherwise it would turn red. Volunteers could select a new choice as many times as they wanted in order to get the correct answer. After the end of studying, volunteers took a multiple choice quiz where they had to identify 20 fish from the set of 32 that they had studied previously. This quiz was modeled after the Reef exams, and every volunteer took the same quiz, so the results are directly comparable. 27 volunteers agreed to participate in the experiment initially, but then only 17 of them ended up taking the quiz at the end. Of those 17, there were almost twice as many females as males, and there were slightly more scuba divers than non-scuba divers. The age of the volunteers skewed younger, though there were volunteers from all of the different age groups. After all was said and done, most of the volunteers did very well in the quiz. 7 of 17 scored perfectly, and 14 of 17 scored higher than 80%, which is the minimum passing score for the first level surveyor exam in Reef. While volunteers were using the study tools, the tools were also measuring how long each volunteer studied for. Though the experiment asked volunteers to study for 15 minutes, 5 minutes a day for 3 days, and most of the volunteers studied much longer as this was only a minimum. Some volunteers even studied several times longer than what was asked of them. Looking at the average quiz score, there was not a large difference between volunteers who used the flashcard tool versus those that used the multicard tool. Both averages were over 80%, and the standard deviation overlapped significantly for both types of tools. Splitting the results across demographics, we do see some differences between male and female volunteers. Interestingly, non-scuba divers who use the multicard tool scored significantly lower than all other groups. 2 of the 3 volunteers who scored less than 80% fall into the split, and the other 1 volunteer who scored less than 80% was also a non-scuba diver. When testing for significance using students' t-test, I used a threshold of p less than 0.001. When looking at quiz scores split by study tool, gender, and scuba diving, none of the results met this threshold for significance. Wanting to see how the amount of time studied may have factored in, I created a metric called quiz points per minute studied. Though an artificial measure, it is essentially an average of how many points a volunteer gained on the quiz for each minute studied. Or more simply put, the quiz score divided by the number of minutes studied. Using this value, we can see that there is a large difference between the flashcard group and the multicard group, suggesting that the multicard group was more efficient. That is, the multicard group studied less while scoring just as high as the flashcard group. Unfortunately, the p-value for this still did not meet significance, but it is the lowest p-value from the experiment at 0.01. In conclusion, while none of the results are significant, there is still promise with a modified experimental design. One issue is that almost all of the volunteers did very well, indicating that the quiz may have been too easy, or they may have been allowed to study for too long, or the material itself may have just been too simple. And so what this did was this prevented a normal distribution of results, instead all being bunched up towards the 100% mark. Another issue with this experiment is that the sample size was relatively small. So a future experiment or a future extension of this experiment would include a larger sample size with more volunteers, which would hopefully lead to more concrete results. I'd like to thank all of the volunteers who participated in the experiment, including those who participated in the experiment and took the quiz at the end, but also those who helped me test the study tools, both the flashcard and the multicard tool, before the experiment actually started to make sure that those were usable and worked as intended. I'd also like to thank my employer, Dassault Systems Biovia, for letting me use Pipeline Pilot, the tool that I used to build the study tools. I built the quiz with it, and then I also did all of the data collection and analysis with Pipeline Pilot as well. I thank you for your time, and I hope you and your family are staying safe and healthy during this pandemic.